So you understand this degree of conflictuality when you think, in fact, of what this could really be like in practice. And Elric is a great king. He ruled also for relatively long, consistently long time for time standards, between 466 and 484. And this is a moment of glory for the Visigoths, because they began expanding in Gaul, right? Eventually, as you know, their kingdom would be solidly implanted in Spain, kind of still was, but at this point, Gaul for them was more important. This was still the kingdom of Toulouse. It wasn't the Hispanic, the Iberian kingdom. It was still about Aquitaine, and they thought, the Visigoths thought, they could invade, in fact, the rest of Gaul and kind of contended it to other barbarians. The word there, and as you know, these were also the last years of the Western Roman Empire, so Roman power was evaporating in the region, and the Visigoths felt rightfully to be the single most powerful entity now, because let's be honest, the Vandals had settled substantially in Africa. They had left the Iberian Peninsula. The Franks were a thing, the Alemanni too, partially the Burgundians as well, but the Merovingian power is still yet to be born as we know it, so actually that would come at the expense of the Visigoths, as we will see later on. But at this point, the Visigoths were objectively the most powerful Germanic people in the West, so they rightfully felt as if they had this moral duty to even continue the Roman rule, because let's remember this is what the Germans were thinking at this point. Never think these Germans came thinking that what was the empire was something separated from them. Like, the concept of imperium transcended Romanity. It was part of all the Indo-European peoples as a idea of political culture. It was based on effective military command given by the deity, by the divinity. So at this point, the Visigoths, that as we have seen, had a very privileged relation with Rome, started feeling that they could be the Western successors of Rome, or better, to rule on behalf of Rome. And this is something that we have stressed a lot in Schwerpunkt, talking about the Franks, that also had a longer history and therefore kind of more important in historical perspective. But the Visigoths objectively had this massive importance at the time that is not to be overlooked, right? And especially before the defeat at the hands of the Merovingians, they were quite of a massive power on their own. Consider Eric dies in 484, so the Ostrogoths are yet to enter Italy and to establish what would in turn become the most powerful entity at that point, together with the Merovingian one in northern Gaul. So the Visigoths are really feel legitimately entitled to this, and the Eric fought a series of wars with the Suebi, first of all, that were this pain in the behind, because, talking about the Iberian Peninsula, if you consider it geographically speaking, it's consider that, it's extensionally speaking, it's enormous, right? I think France is larger than Spain, but Spain plus Portugal are larger extensionally than France. So it's an enormous area. It's terribly diverse for landscape, climate. It's very tough to control. Like, ask the Romans, would took basically 200 years before actually managing to conquer it. Like, it's a terrible ground, and these peoples like the Suebi, the Cantabri, the Basques, the Asturias, they live into this far north west that were also heavily, very scarcely Romanized areas, because they were so primitive in many ways, that they still held. There were even Bacaude at one point into the north of Spain, like, that had happened in Gaul, even in regions like Arbonica. So, in a certain sense, the Visigoths represented in Spain in fact, the area that had been under Roman control. I mean, the Visigoths were the kind of the civilized ones compared to these other peoples that, of course, had inhabited regions who were Romanized as well, but were kind of more difficult to control. I mean, it would be the same under Islam. You know, the Christians would flee to the north, and the Muslims never actually managed to conquer these outskirts in the north. It's always the same old story, and you have to understand this continuity over time because it's very important. And the concept here is the Suebi. The Visigoths still have a great power at this point. Like, especially after the Majorianus expedition has failed, they have enough power. They have enough. There's nobody that can wipe them out easily. So these other nations in the north are kind of weaker. So the Visigoths have the powers and still the national cohesion, the functionality still of a migration people that has just settled. However, to stick together and to launch these periodic expeditions from the central plateaus of Iberia towards the outskirts. Right. In fact, Eric managed to retain some influence let's say the Suebi had retained some influence in Lusitania even after the defeats of the previous generations, but Eric brought at this point most of this region under Visigothic power, most of it, especially taking Emerita Augusta, Merida in Spain, in Extremadura, if I'm not wrong, in 469. Eric also attacked the Western Roman Empire at this point, capturing the Hispania Tarraconensis that had still remained into Roman hands. This is very interesting because it's this area in the northeast of Spain that also has, the important. There was Barcelona. It was an area that was strongly connected with more the Mediterranean dimension than the central plateau. Is a bit like Aragon, like in Castilla, as they would become historically speak. I'm not kidding. I mean, there are discontinuities. Excuse me. And in fact, they're also very fascinating to consider on a geographical base. All the various Iberian valleys and rivers, and mountain chains that separate them. In this sense, and Eric at this point also attacked therefore, with the Hispania Tarraconensis, the last bastion of Roman rule in Spain, right? By 476, he had expanded his rule to the Rhone and the Loire rivers, right? That means reaching as far as Provence and Brittany, so covering most of all Aquitaine. Right, and that also has is strategic coherence and logic. It's a compact area, even with a certain cultural cohesion, right? And he had occupied the key Roman cities of Arles and Marseille that are some of the most important on the Rhone Valley, and very important strategic centers, and that were strongholds even towards the west, and quite important, especially for trade routes from the Mediterranean into central Gaul, through the Rhone. And in his campaigns, Eric had counted on a portion of the Gallo-Roman and Hispano-Roman aristocracy who served under him as generals and governors. So the integration is already taking place, and especially that's what a monarchy needs now, because a monarchy needs a territorial continuity that has to be administered, needs educated personnel, the local aristocracy supports as well, so that's kind of necessary. And the Visigothic kingdom was formally recognized when the Western Roman Emperor Julius Nepos, that ruled between 473 and 480, signed an alliance with Eric, granting him the lands south of the Loire and the west of the Rhone in exchange for military service and the lands in Provence, including Arles and Marseille. So this is very important because even all these various pretend that Nepos is technically the true last Western Roman emperor. It's not Romulus Augustus. He had maintained some lands into the northeast of Italy and in Illyria actually, and he had formally recognized the fact that no, those lands belong to him. This was very important for the Germans, that always sought recognition from the side of the empire and never dreamed, especially in the case of the Ostrogoths, to kind of escape it. Like, there are very few Germanic peoples who settled into the Roman territory didn't get any recognition, didn't seek for any recognition, namely the Longobards, that were completely largely non-Romanized. They didn't give a damn. They had a different political. But when you take the Visigoths, the Franks, you see that they were seeking for that all the time, all the freaking time. This was very convenient, right? Because it was also a way to, in fact, to co-opt the local aristocracy, like saying, look, we are here ruling on the name, even if it was just a formality, but it was still a legitimizing element for the Germanic rule. The lands in Hispania remained under de facto Visigothic control as well. Those had not been recognized. After Odoacer deposed the last Roman emperor in the west, Romulus Augustus, the alleged last Roman emperor in the west, Euric quickly recaptured Provence, a fact which Odoacer formally accepted in a treaty as well. So Odoacer wasn't much of a power in his own times. He was just the chief of this bands of Germans that were made up the Italian army. But of course the Visigoths were much more powerful, and Odoacer's rule would crumble under the Goths of Theodoric. Then instead would gain the upper hand, would also expand into Provence, where his successor actually, after the Franks had repelled the Visigoths, in fact, in there. By the year 500, the Visigothic kingdom centered at Toulouse, that is still the capital, bear it in mind, controlled Gallia Aquitania and Gallia Narbonensis, most of Hispania, with the exception of the Suebic kingdom of Galicia, right, in the northwest, and small areas controlled by independent Iberian peoples, such as the Basques and the Cantabrians. Elric's son Alaric II, who ruled between 484 and 507, issued a new body of laws known as the Breviarium Alarici, and held a church council at Agde in southern France. And this is important because you see here that there is the progressive sedentarism. We will see Visigothic law a bit later, but it's important because that reflects the progressive Romanization of the Goths, at the point that actually finding a difference between Romans and Germans at this point doesn't quite make sense. They were kind of becoming, with some anachronism, kind of Spanish. And this is the problem. This is the dynamic to which that happens also in other Western countries with Germanic migration. So these groups in this already, pretty clearly outlined, let's say, provincial dimensions. The Visigoths now came also into conflict with the Franks. This is very important. Under Clovis, that we have discussed and will be keeping to discuss ad nauseam, let's say, on Schwerpunkt, because he had conquered and unified, essentially under a unique monarchy, his own, northern Gaul, right? And following a brief war with the Franks, Alaric was forced to put down a rebellion into Tarraconensis, probably caused by the recent Visigoth immigration to Hispania due to pressure from the Franks. So which means that this most Romanized area of the Tarraconensis didn't like the Goths to settle in there, and so they rebelled. And probably, I don't think that, there was surely, in my opinion, some contact with the Franks, of course, some coordination with these movements, also because they knew there that the Franks could have not probably intervened in up there. In fact, they wouldn't. So they tried to make this kingdom crumble, but it was solid enough to maintain it. And the proof is the major loss that actually the Visigoths suffered at this point, and the fact that they still survived as a kingdom, because in 507 the Franks attacked again, this time also allied with the Burgundians that had settled in this area between basically the Jura mountains and the Massif Central. In fact, the Burgundians they weren't much of a powerful people. I made a video about them, the Burgundians. I think the islanders of migration here, because that's the etymology of the name. That I titled these videos just like with the etymology of what their names would be, and they would be absorbed by the Franks later on. I mean, in this same period, basically. But they fought, however, against the Goths, and Alaric II himself was killed at the Battle of Campus Vogladensis in Latin, better known as the Battle of Vouillé, near Poitiers in Aquitaine, and Toulouse was sacked by the Franks. So the capital of the Visigoths was hit pretty hard, and therefore local rule evaporated in Aquitaine, because by 508 the Visigoths had lost basically almost all of their Gallic holdings, except for Septimania in the south. Septimania is simply this stripe of land. It would be today's Languedoc-Roussillon. I think it's southern France. It is stripe, coastal stripe that takes its name from allegedly the fact that it could be covered on horseback in 7 days, hence Septimania. And the Battle of Vouillé is very important in European history, because especially for what concerned the development of, I would say, of not much of Gaul, because I think that Aquitaine remained kind of always separated over time, even under the Carolingian, Merovingian and Carolingian rule, kind of a decentralized thing. But for Spain proper, like for in fact what the Visigothic kingdom became at this point, was mostly an Iberian thing. Thinking about it geographically, it's pretty obvious, and this brought, in my opinion, to an end, first of all, of Visigothic expansion outside of the Iberian Peninsula. There were certain Frankish invasions that were matched actually by the Visigoths pretty, somewhat effectively. And the Franks at this point were pretty damn powerful. Like they had become an empire proper. Like every Germanic people normally ruled just on its own people. And the Franks under Clovis start ruling on several other peoples. They start ruling, in fact, on the Alemanni that they had defeated, on the Burgundians that they had defeated, on the Aquitanians, the Visigothic Aquitanians. That there was the big power in the West, and I made several videos about this. If you go in the Migration Era playlist, you find plenty of that. And it's actually a very fascinating story, because you realize that these Franks had, since the very first beginning, a truly imperialistic ideal. But it's somewhat... the Visigoths were ruling, theoretically just on Spain, but as we've seen in the Iberian Peninsula, but in the Iberian Peninsula there were other peoples, as we've seen, and this is fascinating because through the Western Romano-Germanic history you can find out a lot of fascinating things about how these peoples trying to emulate their own the Roman Empire on their own smaller scale, like even the Anglo-Saxon with the Bretwalda thing, and even the fact that as soon as they set foot in there, they decided they had to rule over the Celts and the Celtic fringe. Well, same thing with the Visigoths in the Iberian Peninsula, that had objectively this massive central and southern power in the area, and they wanted to extend it over all the other peoples and making the Iberian Peninsula a unique power, right? And a pretty, for the times, a pretty powerful one. Naturally, this is the early Middle Ages. It's not that these powers have a tremendous potential in terms of expansionism, etc. The things start to slow down a bit for all Eurasia by a certain standard. But the Visigoths, of course, they were wiped out in a blow by the Muslims, and therefore that cut for us a very interesting development that was taking place in there. And so we all concentrate on the Franks, of course, because they crushed the Longobards, while in fact the Visigoths were crushed by the Muslims. But there were very interesting developments going on there, and especially in Visigothic Spain, the development of a sort of Byzantine Empire in miniature, we can say, even if it's like an exaggerated term. But as we will see now with the councils of Toledo, the Visigothic monarchy wanted essentially to emulate the same more than Caesar papism of Constantinople, which actually in Spain was the other way around, because it was the ecclesiastics, hence the Hispano Visigothic elites that controlled the king and not vice versa. But the councils of Toledo grew like with an enormous spiritual force that even began to rival with Rome as a center of theological disputes and spiritual authoritativeness, etc., and trying to imitate increasingly more the Byzantine models of power, right? They also began to develop a liturgy on their own. Of course, Visigothic Spain has its own enormous cultural influence. We're talking about the Visigothic script. I think about even the exodus that the Visigothic intelligentsia after the Muslim conquest that fled to the Carolingian court in other areas of Central Europe and spreading culture. The Visigoths were pretty damn educated for those time standards. Think about figures like Isidore of Seville, that was during the Middle Ages one of the single most he had written the Christian encyclopedia. Like every Christian in the West would read Isidore of Seville for knowing what it had to be known about the universe. This encyclopedic knowledge and this great continuity actually with the Roman legacy that is to be found in Spain during Visigothic rule, simply because Spain had objectively not undergone massive transformations into the late antiquity, right? Gaul and Spain, always remember this, because it's not true for the rest of the West. Gaul and Spain have an enormous continuity with the Roman past, an enormous one, especially Spain. If you were to identify the region that the single most kind of Romanized province in the Old West was really Spain at that point. Because Anglo-Saxon England, of course, it was the least Romanized of all. The Italy, as the heart of the empire, actually was destroyed by the Gothic War in the Longobards, kind of Germanized it culturally speaking in a massive way. That there wasn't much of a Roman, like everybody thought to be a Longobar. The Visigoths thought to be Visigoths, but they also basically extended Roman legal practice and culture, at the point that they were renowningly also the most Romanized of the various Romano-Germanic kingdoms standing before the Islamic conquest. So telling the story of this entity is very fascinating, in my opinion. I must confess I've never enormously deepened my knowledge about this area and its times, but I think it's the more I read about it, the more it's fascinating. This was a very composite world as well. The idea you can observe about the Visigothic kingdom is, first of all, the idea of a decline. This is also normal, actually, in every other Romano-Germanic kingdom, except possibly the Longobard one before the Carolingian conquest. But even the same Franks, in fact, had decayed. I mean, if you take the Merovingian Empire, let's take this pair, Visigoths and Franks, and Visigoths and Merovingians more specifically. objectively, these kingdoms collapsed, right, in different ways. The Visigoths were being a bit more Romanized, had more than else, more than a true decline, in a disruptive sense. They had just the increasing expansion of ecclesiastical and aristocratic power at the expense of Toledo's, that we will see now, that will become the next capital in the center of Spain, of the Visigothic kingdom, being restricted. Like at the moment of the Islamic conquest, basically the Visigoths would rule. The Visigothic monarchs would have an effective rule around just like maybe 30 miles around the capital. The rest was in the hand of all these great noblemen of Romano Germanic origin that at that point would hold all the land, all the latifundia that had remained standing, right? If you wonder, because it's paradoxical, the fact that the latifundia remained intact eroded public authority, because basically there were these massive private landowners who did whatever the heck they like, just like in Gaul. The only Romano-Germanic, it's very interesting that actually Anglo-Saxon England and Longobard Italy were the systems that, being the least Romanized, were progressing more than the others, because their monarchies strengthened over time, especially the Longobard one, while this more, like, let's say, this bigger and more articulate and wealthier systems like Visigothic Spain and Merovingian Gaul declined, right? Merovingian Gaul mainly declined instead for dynastic reasons, because Gaul is a place where the monarchy actually wins over the magnates, but in the sense that the institution of the monarchy gained power, and even if the Merovingian kingdom split into four, because at each generation the Franks distributed their legacy, their inheritance to their own children, including in the Merovingian dynasty, that dynasty remained kind of. Of course, there are, if we think about the Carolingians, try to stress also this continuity for legitimization, of course, but something really remained. In the Visigothic kingdom, it was different. There was never quite a true dynasty. It was always felt that this was an elective monarchy of some sort. I mean, there were real dynasties at one point, but they were pretty troubled times for the monarchy itself, not necessarily for the Iberian Peninsula as a whole, right? And the general impression that you get also from Gaul is that between the second half of the 6th century, with the epidemics, Justinian's pandemics, the general decline with demographic and economical crisis, you can measure, especially on the base of the military capabilities of the sovereigns, how these systems were shrinking in terms of availability of resources. Like, as we will see now, at the time of Vigilt, the Visigoths could launch massive campaigns all around, subduing enemies. At the eve of the Islamic conquest, they couldn't do it anymore, right? So, but it's still interesting how this system remained even a sort of sense of proto-national unity, with necessary distinctions, of course. And it developed as a shared system in some way, in something that was recognizable as a kingdom, like as something that it wasn't just a public power, but a private power, but kind of an entity that transcended, that had even a spiritual, sacred meaning, right? And it's very important. And to this, we have to thank chiefly the councils of Toledo, right? And this enormously powerful ecclesiastical aristocracy that represented it. So after Alaric II's death, his illegitimate son Gesalec took power until he was deposed by Theodoric the Great, that was the ruler of the Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy, who had invaded and defeated him at Barcelona. Yes, the Ostrogoths landed at Barcelona, and they intervened, in fact, into the Visigothic affairs. They rendered a sort of client state on their own, on the base of kinship, both in terms of the ruling monarchies, familial relation, also because they were Goths, right? So there would be a lot to talk about this as well, what the Goths represented in the balance between the Mediterranean, with Constantinople and the Franks, etc. The Visigoths were relatively more passive in this picture than the Ostrogoths, but they still represented a bulk of power into this context. There was Arian, there was Goth, and that was opposed to Frankish expansionism, right? The Ostrogoths and the Visigoths were both. The Ostrogoths occupied southeastern Gaul, the Visigoths southwestern Gaul, as we've seen, and they were all concerned about the northern Gallic push of the Merovingians. So the idea was to stamp them, and in fact the Visigothic, the Justinian reconquest was not aimed just to reconquer the Ostrogothic kingdom, but also to retake especially southern Spain. It was the most intensely Romanized. Southern Spain was one of the most radically and intensely Romanized land of the whole Roman Empire, and that's where the Byzantines were they take the control of, even if it was progressively eroded by the Visigothic kings afterwards. But it still took a long time before they could do something concrete. It was very progressive, and the Visigothic kingdom didn't have any, much of a way to react to that. Visigothic, the Ostrogoths in Italy fought for 2 or 3 times back and forth in the peninsula. When Justinian invaded southern Spain, even though he had been called by Athanagild, they didn't do much immediately about it. It took some time. It took Vigilt chiefly, but we will see it now, to launch some offensives in there, and they weren't decisive by themselves, even if basically those lands were doomed to fall to the Visigoths sooner or later, especially after the Byzantines had lost all the west to the eastern provinces to Islam, right? At this point, Jezelik fled and regrouped, but was defeated actually at Barcelona itself, and was captured and killed now, so they got over with it. And Theodoric at this point installed his grandson Amalaric, right, who ruled in fact as Visigothic king, and son of Alaric II and of Theodoric's daughter, between 511 and 531. Amalaric, however, was still a child, and power in Spain remained under the Ostrogothic general and regent Theudis. Only after Theodoric's death in 526 did Amalric obtain control of his kingdom. His rule did not last long, as in 531 Amalric was defeated by the Frankish king Childebert I, who was son of Clovis, right? So you see this generational clashes. Think about the hatred that existed between, of course, these people. This in 2 confrontations. In the Goths, Clovis kills Alaric II, and his son kills Amalric. That was the son of the Visigothic king. So think about the enmity existing between the Franks and the Visigoths. It's terrifying, and it's also these repeated defeats mean something, meaning that of course the Franks represented the greatest power in this context, and they were the most effective militarily speaking. Theudis, ruling between 531 and 548, became king. He expanded Visigothic control over the southern regions. But he was also murdered after a failed invasion of Africa. This interest is very important, I think, because it shows that the Visigoths at this time had still some thought about expanding further their empire into a broader western dimension and attacking, however, the weakest side in the south. But also you see the political instability of this kingdom. This monarchs killed or in battle or assassinated, and this caused problem. In fact, at this point, Visigothic Spain suffered a civil war under King Agila I between 549 and 544, which prompted Roman Emperor Justinian I, right, to send an army and carve out the small province of Spania for the Byzantine Empire along the coast of southern Spain. Agila was eventually killed, and his enemy Athanagild, ruling between 552 and 568, became the new king. He attacked the Byzantines, but he was unable to dislodge them from southern Spain, and was obliged to formally acknowledge the suzerainty over the empire. Of the empire, of course. And this is important as well because it shows you at this point the Byzantines have reconquered the whole Mediterranean, so the Visigoths are still in that situation they had been at the time of Vogladensis, in which they freak out because they realize they don't have enough power to cope with this massive power that plus has wiped out the Ostrogoths and therefore has isolated them diplomatically speaking, because the Franks are sweeping in the north of into Gaul, even to Italy. So the Franks actually are much more concerned about the Byzantines and vice versa at this point. So this contributes the Visigoths to say, okay, we will be fine here in the Iberian Peninsula, don't touch us, we recognize the imperial suzerainty, and everything will be fine. Which was cool, because they also realized very clearly that the Byzantines didn't have the power and strength to extend their control further, and probably they weren't even interested, because aside from southern Spain, objectively the rest of the Iberian Peninsula wasn't terribly advanced at the point that they cared about occupying it. They just wished them, to remain, essentially, the Visigoths to remain allies of the empire, and that was it, right? But in fact, the reconquest of southern Spain for the Byzantines was the least important of all the others. The first one was Italy, then of course Africa in terms of importance. Spain was achieved because it had its own power. It was important essentially for a coastal dimension, right? Consider that it encompassed the Balearic Islands. Southern Gaul was technically in parts, especially in the coastal centers, Roman, right? We don't have any knowledge about the Byzantine reconquest, like sending troops into southern Gaul, but we do know that there were mints that are kept striking imperial coinage, right? Which was normal because there were imitation of things all over the place here, but that still meant something in the sense that this is a broader empire that doesn't need borders like sharp lines. It's more the deterrent capacity of the Byzantine army and fleet that has that makes the empire in itself. So technically, the Visigoths at this point were fine with the idea of still being part of this system, and they keep more than else trying to consolidate their central power, and this is where, in fact, the Visigoths turn mostly not anymore towards a Mediterranean policy, but to a strictly Iberian one. And the next Visigothic king was very meaningful into this. It was one of the greatest ones, named Leo Vigilt, ruling between 569 to 586. Important reign. He was a very active and effective military leader. He consolidated Visigothic power in Spain. Leovigild campaigned against the Romans themselves in the south in the 70s of the 6th century, and he took back Cordova after another revolt. This doesn't mean that it was seeking for like a new Mediterranean dimension, but eroding what was Iberian of the Byzantine province of Spania, right? And he also fought, importantly, in the north against the Galician kingdom of the Suebi, and various small independent states, including the Basques and the Cantabrians. And these peoples, by the way, had caused troubles. Like there had been, as always in Spain, like it had happened with the Romans, it was happening here, like with the Visigoths, it would happen with the Muslims. It's as if the Reconquista had always been there one way or another. It was these peoples from the north who kept kind of resisting in a way or another and launching raids, because that's what they could do. Like, and this central power in the south in the center, in this case in the south, trying to stem them and to force them into recognizing their role, but not effectively being able, especially in this early medieval context where there was an objective shortage of resources, to effectively to make this to occupy those lands, right? It was extremely tough grounds. Ask everybody who fought in Spain ever, historically, if they were still alive, what the hell of a terrain Spain is. I mean, ask the Romans, who had kind of their own Vietnam in there, aside they won, aside from different from the United States, but paying a much heavier toll for that. Ask, in fact, the Visigoths were trying to counter the peoples. Ask the Muslims were, trying to subdue the Northerners, the Christians. It was a terrible experience. Like, it was really a nightmare. I can't think of worst. Like, Southern Europe is a literal hell when it takes fighting, because it's mostly mountains, right? Either take Spain or Italy or the Balkans. That's all mountains. It's one of the toughest terrains ever. Like, some of the bloodiest strategic theaters ever. So this is raiding warfare, sometimes cattle warfare as well. The local communities, the Visigothic kings are able naturally to mount up the larger expeditions with the army, the traditional levy of the freemen and other communities. But of course, there are lots of other kind of communities within the under Visigothic control that still kind of fight on their own along the frontier. Vigilt, however, succeeded partially in, with deterrent and very heavy and harsh measures to pacify somewhat northern Spain, right? But as we've said, he was unable to completely conquer these peoples. When Vigilt established his son Ermenegild as joint ruler, a civil war ensued between them. Here we're talking about, in fact, religious problems. Vigilt was still an Arian, while his son was the first Visigothic king to convert to Nicene Christianity. Due to his ties with the Romans, importantly enough, which actually shows the Visigoths were actually pretty active actively in contact with Constantinople at this time. And this is very important because you can imagine what the political factions were at this point. I mean, there was the problem of being either pro or against Roman monarch. This was of dramatic importance because the Roman Empire could support you. Like, here we are still at the end of the 6th century, right? The crisis of the Byzantine Empire is not yet there. It will... it's there in the sense there's been the plague and whatever, but they still haven't lost territory like at the beginning of the 7th century, in the 30s, etc. So now, siding with the Romans or not is a big deal, and being Arian or Catholic here is probably not much of a big religious deal in itself, but rather, in fact, a political choice, as always. Like, if you take every single Romano-Germanic kingdoms, but even the same Roman Empire, being Arian and being Catholic was a political thing, always. The religious thing, strictly speaking, it was just, secondary to the whole matter. But here has the division has a deeper meaning. First of all, the fact that you see a civil war once again under such a powerful ruler like Vigilt against his own son that has been elected as a joint ruler tells you that there is something that doesn't quite work well in here. Probably the local nobility had paid its own toll to wage campaigns in the north, and they felt like they wanted to fully put an end to the Arianism, because it was detrimental to the union, like with the local communities. That now this landed Visigothic aristocracy had no reason to be separated from. Arianism, from the other side, still responded to this idea of a warlike monarchy that could, subdue the local population, and having its, pre-existing interest of having had an Arian church on their own and responding only to them. So, in all the other Romano-Germanic kingdoms, the Arians were doomed to fail, right? They would all convert to Catholicism, but these struggles were quite meaningful in Visigothic Spain. In other places, they didn't happen. They didn't happen in Gaul, for example. The Burgundians were Arian for a long time. They were rather tolerant overall. There weren't massive civil, there was massive strife between the two factions. In Gaul, the Franks passed from paganism directly to Catholicism without passing through Arianism. The Longobards were Arians at the beginning. That was a problem for a while, but that there weren't persecutions. There wasn't any actual struggle. It was more a matter of political balance rather than of violence. This flares into Visigothic Spain, flares into violence. It becomes a pretty disruptive thing, and it lasts for long because actually, Hermenegild is defeated in 584 and killed in 585. So just think, Leovigild killing his son. Right, so by the end of his reign, Leovigild had, however, united nominally the entire Iberian Peninsula, right, including the Suebic kingdom, which had been conquered in 585, exploiting a Suebi civil war that ensued after the death of King Miro. Leovigild established amicable terms with the Franks too, through royal marriages. And they remained at peace throughout most of his reign, which means that basically now the Visigoths and the Franks didn't have quite of a hatred, hostility towards each other. Of course, the Visigoths at this point were more from the Roman side that the Franks had become to dislike, because they were the Byzantines, after they had wiped the Ostrogoths, had become their next neighbors, and they had probably made the Justinian reconquest overall also to counter Merovingian expansionism in this Atlantic perspective, let's say. But the Franks had understood it, aside from border warfare, skirmishes, more or less the Visigoths were now into Spain. The Franks were into Gaul, so they were neatly separated, more or less, aside from Septimania. So the Pyrenees were the barrier, and that was it. There wasn't any interest now especially for the Franks, to invade Spain or to do anything like that. It would have been a failure, of course. So this changes the relations and shows you how the thing was evolving towards other bases of power. Leovigild also founded new cities, such as Recopolis, right, and Victoriacum, that it would be today's Vitoria, in Vitoria-Gasteiz, in the capital of the city of the Basque country, in northern Spain, and it seems that, in fact, Leovigild was the Visigoths, as we were saying at the beginning, were the only founders of new cities. In this context of the first centuries of the Middle Ages, among the various Romano-Germanic kingdoms, which is very interesting because it shows. If you see the location of these cities, you notice a pretty strongly strategic character of them, right? Think about Recopolis, that is in the north of Spain, right? In the north, towards the north. Recopolis is actually in the center of Spain. I meant Victoriacum, that which Victoriacum is in this far north, right? So that's obviously a military colony that wants to be controlled, to be a useful, the troublesome northern frontier, right? On becoming king, Vigilt's son Recared, who ruled between 586 and 601, converted from Arian to Chalcedonian Christianity. Right, so this led to some unrest in the kingdom initially, notably a revolt by the Arian bishop of Merida, which was put down. So further war, which is not good. I would like to stress the fact that, if you consider the history of other Roman and Germanic kingdoms, this instability, especially at this temporal height, is very detrimental, economically speaking, right? Also, Recared beat back another Frankish offensive in the north, right? He also oversaw the Third Council of Toledo in 589. It was a very important one, in which he basically announced his fate in the Nicene Creed and denounced the Arians. He adopted the name of Flavius, the family name of the Constantinian dynasty, which is very important, and styled himself as the successor of the Roman emperors. Now, this is extremely important because you realize that this is effectively the full Romanization of the Visigothic monarchy, the passing to Catholicism, which is aimed to, of course, to strengthen the internal orthodoxy in changing a lot of things. I mean, talking orthodoxy not just from a religious point of view, but literally from a political one. This change brings fundamentally to the great transformation of the kingdom as a from the original Arian character that was mostly an aristocratic model towards a kind of of warriors, towards a more monarchic and territorial one that resembles, in fact, it takes inspiration from the Byzantine Empire. The councils of Toledo were modeled after the ones of Constantinople. Just like the Visigothic court was kind of styled after the Byzantine one. The Flavius was also a title given not just to the heirs of Constantine, but of course to the Germans as well, because it means blonde, literally, and that's what Germans usually took as a kind of an ethnic character. Being blonde, there was all a ethical, sort of an aesthetical model attached to Germanism in itself. So this still means that the Visigoths believe in their ethnical pride of having been the successors of Rome in Spain. They feel they have taken the imperium on their shoulders, but they want to imitate the Romans always more, which is very important for the following developments of the Visigothic kingdom and the growth of importance, especially of the councils of Toledo, right, that become the main political, institutional, theological event of we could say of the whole West, because Rome, of course, is more important, authoritative, and spiritually important. But the Visigothic Council of Toledo acquires a national character, which is other local councils do not have in the West, and they also existed elsewhere, however. Recared, at this point, even fight the Byzantines, right, in Hispania and Baetica, in the very south, after they had begun, however, a new offensive, right? So they, there is this territorial containment, even of Byzantine expansionism. Recared's son Liuva II became king in 601, but was deposed by the Visigothic noble Witteric, ruling between 603 and 610, ending the short-lived dynasty also. this one other indicator that things were not that good. That monarchic power had tried to style itself into this kind of central fashion, but that the aristocracy now is gaining confidence, is gaining power through the same councils, right, of Toledo, and through the ecclesiastic power that is largely trying to maintain its own sphere of power there, is mingling with other aristocrats. And in fact, there is this series of Visigothic kings between 610 and 631 that can be considered as another period of instability, as it's so constant regicide, and this is not good, once again. These things are very important to understand the local stability of a power, right? This period also saw the definitive conquest of the Byzantine territories in the south, though. What this means is that the Visigoths, now these aristocrats, had the capabilities to contain the monarchy, to overthrow kings, but also to expand in their own direction. So here's in the 7th century this turning point that you also start understanding less, because there is less documented, but that shows a pretty troubled situation. War continued, for example, in the north against the Basques and the Asturians, right? As indeed it would continue for the rest of the Visigothic kingdom's existence, which is not also the proof of very sound power with a deterrent, military deterrent is capable of, suppressing this activity on the frontier. And however, there is to say that the Visigothic kings at this time worked on the religious legislature, especially the king Sigismund, ruling between 612 and 621, who passed several harsh laws against the Jews and forced many Jews to convert to Christianity. It was part of the Catholicization of the Visigothic political practice and juridical practice that was styled after the repression of the Jews that Justinian had enacted during his reign. So that was an important model for the Visigoths as well. The idea of controlling these Jewish communities and to kind of confine them in certain places and to, in part, seize part of their power. Actually, the Jews in Spain, especially along the Mediterranean coast, were pretty powerful. They would remain. They were farmers mostly, but there were many, right? And this, of course, the monarchy tended to expand at their own expenses, as in other times. And this would probably also cause further instability in the kingdom, because the Jews were many, and even at the Islamic invasion, seemingly they sided with the invaders because of all the harshness to which they had been treated by the local kings, right? And Sigismund was, however, successful against the Byzantines, expanding further the Visigothic kingdom, taking several other cities, including Malaga. And the Byzantines were finally defeated only by Suintila, reigning between 621 and 631, who had captured all of their Spanish holdings by 625. Suintila was deposed by the Franks. Interestingly enough, that also this time were, seeing a bit of revival of power, thanks to a temporary reunification of their domains. And the Visigothic king was replaced with Sisinand. That was another, Visigoth, of course, ruling from 639-636. The instability of this period can be attributed to power struggle between the kings and the nobility, as we have seen. A religious unification definitely strengthened the political power, but the one of the church, which it exercised through church councils at Toledo along with the nobles, right? The Fourth Council, held during the brief reign of Sisinand in 633, even came as far to excommunicate and exile the same king, right, replacing him with Quintila, who ruled between 636-639. The church councils of Toledo were now the most powerful institution in the Visigothic state. They took the role of regulating the process of succession to the kingship by election of the king by Gothic noble senators, and the church officials. They also decided to meet on a regular basis to discuss ecclesiastical and political matters affecting the church. Finally, they decided the kings should die in peace and declared their persons sacred, seeking to end the violence and regicides of the past. Despite all of this, another coup took place, and Quintila was deposed in 639, and King Tulga took his place. He was also deposed in the third year of his reign, and the council elected the noble Kindaswint as king. The reigns of Kindaswint and his son Recheswint saw the compilation of the most important Visigothic law book, the Liber Judicarum, completed in 654. The code included old laws by past kings such as Alaric II in his Breviarium Alarici and Vigilt, but many were also new laws. The code was based almost wholly on Roman law, with some influence of Germanic law in rare cases. The new laws applied to both Gothic and Spanish populations who had been under different laws in the past, and it replaced all older codes of law. Among the eliminated old laws, there were the harsh laws against the Jews. The Liber showed the old system of military civil division in administration was changing, and the dukes, the duces provinciae, and counts comites civitatis had begun taking more responsibilities outside their original military and civil duties. The servants or slaves of the king became very prominent in the bureaucracy and exercised wide administrative powers. With the Visigoth law codes, women could inherit land and title and manage it independently from their husbands or male relations, dispose of their property in legal wills if they had no heirs, and could represent themselves and bear witness in court by age 14 and arrange for their own marriages by age 20. Kindaswint, ruling between 642-653, strengthened the monarchy at the expense of the nobility. He executed some 700 nobles, forced dignitaries to swear oaths, and in the Seventh Council of Toledo laid down his right to excommunicate clergy who acted against the government. He was also able to maneuver his son Recheswint on the throne, sparking a rebellion by a Gothic noble who allied with the Basques, but was put down. Recheswint, ruling between 653 and Recheswint, actually not Svint because that's another king, 672, held another council of Toledo which reduced sentences for treason and affirmed the power of the councils to elect kings. Following Recheswint, King Bamba, ruling between 672-680, was elected king. He had to deal with the initial revolts in Tarraconensis, and because of this he felt a need to reform the army. He passed a law declaring all dukes, counts, and other military leaders, as well as bishops, had to come to the aid of the kingdom once danger became known or risk harsh punishment. Bamba was eventually deposed in a bloodless coup. King Ervig, ruling between 680 and 687, held further church councils and repealed the previous harsh laws of Bamba, though he still made provisions for the army. Ervig had his own son-in-law Egica made king. Despite a rebellion by the Bishop of Toledo, the 16th Council, held in 693, denounced the bishop's revolt, and the 17th Council in 694 passed harsh laws against the Jews, citing a conspiracy, and many were enslaved, especially those who had converted from Christianity. Egica also raised his son Wittiza as co-ruler in 698. Not much is known about his reign, but a period of civil war quickly ensued again between his sons Aquila and Ardo and the king Roderick, who had seized Toledo. So what you have here is the structuration of a power chiefly revolving around the councils, around these aristocracies that within the same kingdom acquire a great power, a greater power, and basically recognize this central territorial entity of the Visigoths that also has to fight with this kind of secessionist movements. If you're thinking about Tarraconensis, doesn't want to be under Visigothic control, but that fundamentally lead a kind of deal with their power kind of as a private business. There is a privatization of power in many ways, de facto, right? And this is difficult, right? It becomes a difficult thing. It's not this kingdom is difficult to manage in some ways, especially from the monarchy. It has, as we have seen, grows passive towards this aristocratic power. So coming to the Muslim conquest of the Visigothic kingdom, in 711, Tariq ibn Ziyad, a Muslim Berber client of Musa bin Nusair, right, the governor of Islamic Africa, under the Umayyad Caliph of Al-Walid I, invaded Spain with about 7,000 Berber men, while Roderick was in the north fighting against the Basques as usual. The tale that Julian, Count of Ceuta, facilitated an invasion because of one of his daughters had been dishonored by Roderick is possibly mythical, but still could reflect basically the rivalries that existed between the monarchy and the aristocracy. And by late July, a battle took place at the Guadalete River in the province of Cádiz, right, so in the very south of Spain. And Roderick was betrayed by his troops who sided with his enemies, and the king was killed in battle, right? The Muslims then took much of southern Spain with little resistance. They went on to capture Toledo, where they executed several Visigothic nobles, so they basically beheaded the Visigothic nobility. And the fact there was such a low resistance speaks for many things, possibly the fact that not much that this kingdom had no cohesion in itself, but that there was no sound central direction at this point that could organize even an effective resistance. There were several stands that were wiped out by the Arabs. Now, in 712, Musa, the governor of Ifriqiya, arrived with another army of 18,000 with a large Arab contingent. He took Merida in 713 and invaded the north, taking Saragossa and Leon, pretty far away, right, which were still under King Ardo in 714. And after being recalled by the Caliph, Musa left his own son Abd al-Aziz in command, and by 716 most of the Iberian Peninsula was under Islamic rule. So this is a lightning conquest, 5 years to conquer such a large space, with even Septimania being taken between 721 and 725. that these local Muslim rulers from Saragossa especially would launch eventually offensives as deep into Gaul until Charles Martel defeated them famously at the Battle of Tours of Poitiers of 732, halting effectively their further expansion towards the north. And the only effective resistance of the Visigoths in this sense was in the Asturias, that, as we have seen, weren't quite Visigoth, were they? I mean, there were, of course, Visigothic noblemen, such as Pelagius, that would become this key figure, Pelayo in Spain, that revolted in 718. Thinking about many Visigoths had fled towards that direction, but in this sense, those lands had remained at the outskirts of the empire, part of the kingdom, and so there is a new reformation, if you want, of the local identity of this massive Muslim tide that had wiped out everything in terms of political cohesion, and that now this peoples in the north decided to stamp they were the last avant-post objective. And in fact, Pelagius managed to defeat the Muslims at the Battle of Cavadonia, right? And this is where resistance also continued in the regions around the Pyrenees with the establishment of the Marca Hispanica from 760 to 785 that eventually was basically invaded by Charlemagne, that actually incorporated it in its own kingdom, its own empire, say better. The Berbers mostly settled in the south in the Meseta Central and in Castilla, and initially the Muslims generally left the Christians alone to practice their religion, right? Although non-Muslims were subject to Islamic law and treated as second-class citizens. So we won't be talking now further about those changes. They're so complicated, and it's not a story that we know entirely well. There would be a lot to say about it, not just for the times, the way it's interpreted, because it's fascinating. But talking about the Visigoths, and what they left, also in terms of legal practice, and think about this law, for example, the Visigothic Code of Law, the Forum Judicum, had been previously part of aristocratic oral tradition and written down in the early 7th century, surviving two separate codices preserved at El Escorial, right? And as you know, the historical residence of the King of Spain in the town of San Lorenzo del Escorial, somewhat 45 kilometers northwest of the Spanish capital, Madrid. It's a fantastic place. I wish I visited it, actually. I hope I will do it somewhat soon. And it goes into more detail, like this law collection. It's very important because it reveals a great deal about Visigothic social structure, right? It tells us so much of how it was actually similar to the Roman one at that point in the 7th century. Like the Visigothic accomplishments in this field are essentially deriving from having easily integrated the various elements and having essentially made a law that was a hybrid between the Germanic and the Roman one, but effectively with a dominantly Roman one at the end of the day. Talking about religion, that is interesting. We have especially touched it now. As we have seen before the Middle Ages, the Visigoths, as well as the other Germanic peoples, had followed what is now referred to as Germanic Paganism. And while the Germanic peoples were slowly converted to Christianity by varying means, many elements of pre-Christian culture and indigenous beliefs remained firmly in place in Spain after the conversion process, particularly in the more rural and distant regions. We've talked about this differences that had existed at a territorial level, the fact that had other populations like the Suebi that had already dwelt in the Iberian Peninsula, and how religion was instrumentalized sometimes on the basis of such political divisions, right? There were deep sectarian splits among the same Catholic population of the Iberian Peninsula, which contributed to the toleration of the same Arian Visigoths on the peninsula, and which is very interesting. The Visigoths scorned to interfere among the Catholics, but were interested in decorum and public order, for example. Vigilt, albeit fighting against his own son, that had converted to the Nicene Creed of Catholicism, he had effectively attempted to restore political unity between the Visigothic Arian elite and this Hispano-Roman Nicene Catholic population, right? Albeit the differences at this point weren't so great to tell it all. But this failed. And especially it seems that the Iberian Visigoths maintained their Christian Arianism, especially the Visigothic elite, until the end of Liuvigil's reign. And when Recred I converted to Catholicism, he sought to unify the kingdom under a single faith. When the Visigoths took over Spain, Jews constituted a large and ancient proportion of the population. Many Jews were farmers, but they worked in a wide range of occupations and were a major component of the urbanized population of the larger towns, particularly of eastern Spain. During the period in which the Visigoths adhered to Arianism, the situation of the Jews seems to have remained relatively good, right? As long as Arianism was enforced, there was no reason for stressing the intolerance. Like, this population had the Visigoths had settled like into a land that was essentially foreign, and the more it remained divided, the more they showed themselves to be tolerant, the better it was, right? Even towards the same Catholics, the Jews could be like a counterweight to them in favor of Arianism. Previous Roman and Byzantine law determined the Jewish status, and it already sharply discriminated against them, telling the truth. But the royal jurisdiction was in any case quite limited at this time of Arianism. Local lords and population related to Jews as they saw fit. We read of rabbis being even asked by non-Jews to bless their fields, right, for example. The Jews also held some ranking posts in the governments of the army, the army, and others were recruited and organized for garrison service. Still, others continued to hold senatorial rank, and in general, then, they were well respected and well treated by the Visigothic kings. That is, until their transition from Arianism to Catholicism. In fact, Catholic conversion across Visigothic society reduced much of the friction between their people and the native Spanish population, and one chief purpose of this conversion was to unify the realm under the Church. Aside from the key complaints of the Church along being that Jews had too much status, prosperity, and influence, local nobles relied on their Jewish and non-Jewish sector of the population to enhance the local economy and the nobles' independent power. Visigothic political structure had traditionally given extensive powers to local nobles, who even elected their kings. So the king was in many ways merely the first among equals, and central authority was weak, as we noticed. The status of the Jews therefore impacted local aristocrats both symbolically and politically. King Recared convened the Third Council of Toledo to settle religious disputations related to the religious conversion from Arianism to Catholicism. The discriminatory laws passed at this council seem not to have been universally enforced, however, as indicated by several more councils of Toledo that repeated these laws and extended their stringency. These entered canon law and became legal precedents in other parts of Europe as well. The culmination of this process occurred under King Sigismund, who decreed a forced Christian conversion upon all Jews in Spain. This mandate apparently achieved only partial success. Similar decrees were repeated by later kings as central power was consolidated. These laws either prescribed forcible baptism of the Jews or forbade circumcision, Jewish rites, and the observance of the Sabbath and other festivals. Throughout the 7th century, Jews were flogged, executed, had their property confiscated, were subjected to ruinous taxes, forbidden to trade, and at times dragged to the baptismal font. Many were obliged to accept Christianity, but continued privately to observe the Jewish religion and practices, and the decree of 613 set off a century of torment for Spanish Jewry, which was only ended by the Muslim conquest. The political aspects of the imposition of the church power cannot be ignored in these matters. With the conversion of the Visigothic kings to Chalcedonian Christianity, bishops increased their power until the Fourth Council of Toledo in 633. They selected a king from among the royal family, a practice previously reserved for nobles, and this was the same synod that declared that all Jews must be baptized, and as far as the Visigoths were concerned, the time for religious pluralism was past. By the end of the 7th century, Catholic conversion made the Visigoths less distinguishable from the indigenous Roman citizens of the Iberian Peninsula. When the last Visigothic strongholds fell to the Muslim armies, whose subsequent invasions transformed Spain from the beginning of the 8th century, their Gothic identity faded. And at the same time, you realize how terrible this these provisions were. You understand fundamentally how the strengthening of the councils of Toledo increased even the intolerance towards the Jewish communities. It would have been interesting to see if what would happen if the Visigothic monarchy had more power actually, and at the detriment, instead of the councils, and see what their interaction with the Jews are, because usually the monarchies benefited actually from Jewish activity in terms of trade, etc. They didn't see them as competitors, but as a useful asset, and this, however, was it wasn't the case, and as we've seen, the same, the harsh treatment of the Jews during Visigothic Catholic phase, and the moment the acme of power of the councils actually weakened the kingdom, because the Jews were many there, and this favored for sure the same Islamic invasion, but it wasn't all. As we said before, the Visigoths were famous also for having founded the only few cities in Western Europe between the 5th and the 8th centuries. It is certain through contemporary Spanish accounts that they founded 4 and possibly a 5th cities ascribed to them by a later Arabic source. All these cities were founded for military purposes, and 3 of them in celebration of victory. The first, Recopolis, was founded by Vigilt in 578 after his victory over the Franks near what is today the tiny village of Zorita de los Canes. He named it after his son Recored, and built it with Byzantine imitation, containing a palace complex and mint. So it's a palace model, right? This is Byzantine Roman model, right? But it lay in ruins by the 9th century after the Arab conquest, and at a slightly later date, Vigilt founded a city he named Victoriacum, we mentioned before, after victory over the Basques, and though it is often supposed to survive as the city of Vitoria, contemporary 12th century sources refer to the latter city's foundation by Sancho VI of Navarre, so there is a dispute about what we said before. Vigilt's son and namesake of the first Visigothic city founded his own sometime around 600. It is referred to by Isidore of Sevilla's Lugo id est Luceo in the Asturias, built after a victory over the Asturians or Cantabria. So another military colony substantially. And the fourth and possibly final city of the Goths was Olojikos, perhaps Olojikos, founded using Basque labor, right, once again in the frontier, in 621 by Suintila, as a fortification against the recently subjected Basques, and it is to be identified with modern Olite. The possible 5th Visigothic foundation is Bayara, perhaps modern Montor, mentioned as founded by Recored in the geography of Kitab al-Ravd al-Mitar. So what can we say about the Visigothic legacy and their importance? Well, a lot actually. The video is very long, so I will stop it very soon, but there is much to reflect about the importance about the Visigoths, that there is even this prejudice sometimes that, the Visigoths, as Germans in pre-Muslim times, were kind of a negative rule, and this is absolutely false, right? The Visigoths were, there was all historiography that spoke bad about them, as if they were the barbarians, but this is actually very false. The Visigoths, we have seen it, were the most Romanized of the Germanic peoples, and they were great preservers of classical culture. They felt a mission to take on this for their own ethnic pride and glory, to their own kingdom, but to make it survive. For example, the bathing culture of Andalusia, often said to be a Muslim invention, is actually a direct continuation of Romano-Visigothic traditions, right? Visigothic Merida housed baths supplied with water by aqueducts, and such aqueducts are also tested in Cordoba, Cadiz, and Recopolis. excavations confirmed that Recopolis and Toledo, the Visigothic capital, were heavily influenced by the contemporary Byzantine architecture, and we've seen also about political ties with Constantinople, how true this was. And when the Muslims looted Spain during the conquest, they were very amazed by the fine and innumerable Visigothic treasures, and there is nothing to be surprised of also in here. The Visigoth kingdom was pretty large, powerful, rich, maybe not very stable as we've seen, but definitely an important central power that had developed and had its own administration and structures and treasures and wealth. And a few of these treasures were preserved as they were buried during the invasion, for example the votive crowns and the treasure of Guarazar. And while only the senior monks were allowed to read books of non-Christian and heretic authors, this did not prevent the rise of intellectuals in Visigothic Spain, most prominently Isidore of Seville, that we mentioned before, one of the most quoted scholars of the Middle Ages, Eugenius I of Toledo, an expert in mathematics and astronomy, that lived in the first half of the 7th century, and Theodulf of Orleans, right, that a theologian and poet who, after he had fled the Frankish kingdom, participated in the Carolingian Renaissance, right. A Muslim source referred to Visigothic Seville as the abode of the sciences, right, the Institutionum Disciplinae from the mid-7th, early 8th century confirms that Visigothic nobles were not only taught in reading and writing, but also in medicine, law, and philosophy. An example of a highly educated nobleman was King Sigismund, who was a patron of learning and writer of poems, and one of them about astronomy. This doesn't mean that the Muslims didn't accomplish but on the anything that the Visigoths hadn't just done before. Of course, there was an evolution also in this sense. But I think that speaking about this tells us so much about what the continuity actually of local traditions was important even for the times of the Caliphate, of the Emirate, of the Caliphate, as Spain was a great pool of culture, of civilization, this Romano-Germanic, Iberian, fertile region. It would be able to sustain, in fact, even the centralized state that the Muslims built in there. And this couldn't be alone done in a place that was so backwards and unevolved, right? So this is very important. And obviously this pertains mostly to the center and the south of Spain that were most advanced, but this also follows patterns, geographical patterns, environmental, dimensions that we have explained before. So what can I say? I'd say for now we'll stop it here. It was a long video, wasn't it? But I hope that you enjoyed it the same. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.